I grew up wanting to be in the police. It was all I ever wanted to do. I loved it. I loved the learning. I loved the variety. I loved working with people. Yeah, it's a very interesting culture and environment to work in. With any organisation, when budgets are cut, the first budgets tend to be from the additional support services. And then that doesn't have an immediate effect, but it does have a knock-on long-term impact. You know, teachers want to teach, they want to be in the classroom, they want to be able to give children that attention. Our system doesn't allow for that. And it's the same for the police, and it's exactly the same for the NHS. People were recognising more that feminine energy, or the left and right brain energy, people were understanding that actually that had its place. We want to be our own critical thinkers and we want to develop. We need to increase our own awareness and we need to increase our own understanding. And I think it's only exposure to other people who are not like us that helps with that.
Hey, welcome to the Leaders Podcast with me, Laura MacDonald, the leadership coach and mentor. Come with me as I explore the elements of leadership that give leaders like you the power and confidence to make the impact you know you can. I'll be sharing my own experiences, top tips and insights, and talking to some very special guests to share their thoughts and leadership experiences on mindset, influence, change and growth. So let's get right to it. I'm spending today's episode with the marvellous Zoe Thompson, founder of Phoenix Coaching Limited, coaching leaders and empowering the public sector professionals to transition into thriving business ownership. Welcome to the Leaders Podcast, Zoe.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this one.
Yeah, me too. My first question to you is one I ask all of my guests, because to serve others well, you have to serve yourself, right? And all of my guests have different ways of doing this. So my question to you is, what have you done to serve yourself in the last 24 hours?
Ooh, good question. I've got an interesting story actually, which I won't go into the whole story, but I am really trying, because I think it's really hard sometimes that work just creeps into any gaps, especially when you're self-employed. It can be really, you need to be really strict on those boundaries. And I found over the last few weeks, I've not been as strict with myself as I have been, and work has just been creeping in. There hasn't been a hard stop. So last night I joined 5 strangers for a meal out. It's they've got a thing on social media. It's called Time Left, and it's just a way to meet other people. So that's what I did last night. I then came home, had a good night's sleep, and I've been to the gym this morning, kind of just checking in on my priorities. So for me, the balance in like the health and well-being, especially when you're self-employed, like there isn't anybody else to pick up when you're not very well. So looking after myself is really important. Having the balance of work and life is really important, and just making sure that I'm spending time on the important things and not just on the shiny objects or the easy to do that crosses things off the list that doesn't actually move anything.
You're totally right about the self-employment thing, but I'm curious about the dinner with strangers. Like, how does that work?
It was honestly, it's the first time I've done it. I saw it months ago and registered, and they do it in lots of different cities. It's not a dating thing, it's just an opportunity for people to go out and meet people that they wouldn't normally get a chance to do. So it's not business, it's not dating. And so you fill out a thing online, you share a little bit about your interests, what kind of work you do, what kind of think there are some things around like politics and things that you like to talk about and hobbies, and they do run something within their computers to match you up with people that they think you will get on with. But it was great. It's 5 different people. There were it was a mix of people, mix of jobs, mix of genders, mix of interests, and the conversation was so varied because we didn't all have one thing in common. And we were all just asking lots of questions about each other, and yeah, it was great, and great food too. So, and for me, it's a great opportunity. So I love eating, I love going out for food, and I got to meet some new people as well. And we've set up a little WhatsApp group. We've said we'll meet again, but we all say that we would like to go and do another one as well. So they run them every week. every week on a Wednesday night in places all around the world. So the
Wow.
next challenge might be to do one in a different city abroad. But somebody who was there last night has moved from New Zealand, wants to meet new people, and said it's a great way to come out and meet people. But
Wow,
it
I
was
love
good.
that. I think
It
that's
was
an
good.
amazing way to meet people. That's really good because because it's like checking that you will get on with people, isn't it?
Yeah. And it wasn't all work chat. It wasn't school parenting chat. It wasn't, because everybody was different. So yeah, it was great.
Oh, I
It was
love that.
great.
I'm definitely trying that on my next Wednesday night off. That just so happens to be
Definitely
my
worth
day
a
of the
go.
week.
Great food, great company. It's perfect.
You started your career as an inquiry officer clerk in the police.
Did.
How did you
Long,
get
long
here?
time ago. A long, long time ago. So, what's the quickest way to tell this story? So, I always wanted to be in the police. My mum and dad met as cadets. So I am here because of the police. Like I would not exist if, or certainly not like this. So my parents met as cadets. My mum's dad was also in the job. I grew up wanting to be in the police. It was all I ever wanted to do. And you couldn't join until you were 18 and a half. We couldn't apply. So when I finished my A levels, I was looking for work that helped increase your life experience. That was what all of the advice was get life experience. And this job came up in the inquiry office at the local police station. So I thought that's perfect. I can go in, I can get life experience, I'm in that environment, and then I can apply to join up. So that was when I was 18. Oh my goodness, what a learning curve. Because this whole world that I just had no idea existed was just standing in front of me day to day. I loved it. I loved the learning. I loved the variety. I loved working with people. And I did apply for the police. I did apply to be an officer, but didn't get through the first time I applied, which then ended up being the only time I applied because I then ended up getting promoted. So a supervisor role came up, and I thought, well, my personal circumstances changed. By that, also the governments were changing, so they weren't recruiting as frequently. And I was like, do I stay where I am and wait for recruitment to open, or do I put my hat in the ring for this opportunity to be a supervisor? So I did, and I got it. So I'd only been in the force for 5 years at that point, and then went into the leadership role of inquiry office staff. So I'd experienced in that role, but also relatively young. So I would have been, I was in my early 20s at that point. I was in the police for 20 years. 15 of those were in leadership roles of varying levels. And then my role was made redundant in 2017. Loved the leadership, loved the self-development, loved the coaching and mentoring side of the leadership roles. So made the decision to set up the business, because at that point it was like, what's the scarier thing? Do you go and work for somebody else, having only ever worked for the police? Or do you set up your own business? And in my naivety of not really understanding what was involved in running a business, I honestly thought that was the easier option. But it also meant that I could put all of the things that I loved doing into one pot and make it my own. And everybody said, oh yeah, you've got all of the skills, all of the, everything you need, you'll be fine. Off you go, blissfully unaware, which is probably a good thing. So yeah, that's how that journey happened over those years, in
Amazing.
short.
So, what were some of the leadership roles that you held in the police then?
So the first role that I had was the senior inquiry office clerk. So that was looking after the teams that looked after the people that come into the police stations. Back then, in the late 90s, people didn't have mobile phones. So you went into the police station, or you called the local police station. So the person who was on the inquiry office would be divided between answering the phone and speaking to people at the desk. So that was my first job. Then the mobile phones really started to come in, so like the late 90s. And so more people were ringing the police, and the demand on the phones was just ridiculous that we couldn't be at the counter and answering the phones. So they decided to bring in some casual staff to help with those inquiries. So I moved into the customer manager role, which helped to train casual staff, which was pretty much partners and children of people that already worked in the police, that we just trained them up to answer the phones. Then that became a proper call centre. So I then was promoted again into the setup of what is now a contact centre, and most police forces have them. From there, I went to major crime investigation team. So I was the logistics manager there. So that was my first senior leadership role, looking after the department that investigate murder and homicide investigations and serious crime. And then from there, I was seconded to the project team. So when the government changed and we had a lot to, the comprehensive spending review came in, we knew that we couldn't make any more trim, it's a horrible expression, but the trim the fat cuts, we'd made all of those over the last couple of years. So they put together a team to reorganize the force. And so I went up, because my roles had been so varied, I was seconded up to there to be part of that program team. And then from there, the reorganization of the force, the introduction of body-worn cameras, which is just what you expect to see with police officers now, but was involved in that rollout, laptops, mobile devices. So a lot of the big changes around what was policing then to what policing is today. So a lot of it was the stakeholder engagement between the police officers, police staff, the people doing the jobs, and the program teams that were implementing. So as the business change manager, I was the go-between, and I love that, because you had the senior responsibility, but you were also on the ground talking to people and working out what works, what doesn't work, and communicating things. So really varied. And that was the great thing about an organization like that, is that you can change your role every couple of years and still stay in the same company, that the cultures are very different, the way that people work is very different. So you get a new experience, but with that safety and security of still being in the same organization.
Definitely. I mean, we've got 2 police officers, members of the police force in my family. So one of them is a police constable. The other one, so she started as an emergency call handler, and then went to PCSO, and has now just taken a role as a community peer mentor. So, and she's the one, I think, that's going to benefit from a lot of the changes that you and your teams have made over the years. She is that person that's sort of changing roles every couple of years and just kind of discovering newer layers about the police force and actually everything they do for the community. And of course, being a call handler to start with has given her a lot of insight that will no doubt help her in all her future roles, because she started on the front end of all emergencies.
100%. I mean, I did 4 years front office, then 4 years senior front office, then went up into what was the non-emergency control room, and they've now kind of merged a lot of that together. But if you can work in those environments, the variety and the skills that you learn and the knowledge that you learn pretty much means you can pick and choose. You've got that experience that translates really well into lots of the other departments, and it's the resilience that you build on top of that, which just works really well across the board.
It's a very unique skill set and type of person, I think, that it takes to do certain jobs in the police. So yeah, if you can build on top of the existing character you have as well, there's not too many people in the world that would be able to be able to do that for a long period of time.
Yeah, and there's lots of different roles that require different characteristics and attributes. So the control room, very, very fast paced, very quick decision making. You have to be really comfortable and confident with making fast decisions with not a lot of information, and then reassessing as more information comes in, which is a skill set in itself. When I went from there to the major crime investigation team, very different team of people, much slower pace, more about the attention to detail, getting it right first time, the very methodical, very process driven, very different, same organization, but just a very different way of working. And so one of the things that would quite often come up in conversations was not necessarily around the ability or capability of individuals, but is this the right fit for what they're really good at? And actually it's a big organization. Where would they be able to excel and be a really high performing individual? What works best for the type of person that their character, the way they think, the way they process, and actually let's not manage people out, but let's find them a role that is much better suited to their skill set and their way of working, which is back then was quite a forward way of thinking, because normally it was like, you're not very good, let's manage you out. Whereas then it was, okay, let's look at the skill set and let's look to see where we can redeploy somewhere where they might be better suited, whether that's in the department or in other departments. But yeah, every department or an area of the business almost has its own culture and way of working because of the type of work and the type of people that do that work. And yeah, it's a very interesting culture and environment to work in.
I think that the person I mentioned a minute ago, it's not surprising to me at all that she's ended up in a peer mentor role.
Yeah.
Because of the type of person she is. I think she knows that like the call center was a great place to start, but becoming a PCSO really opened that door and what she was capable of doing. And she is that person that's able to build quite strong connections with people. She's gone into the peer mentoring side of things and is now making a massive difference with much more targeted, much more serious issues with people. It's quite clear that obviously the police force have had a say in where she goes, but in the same breath, I think she's quite observant in herself and she's willing to give it a try. It's more likely that she would have been the one to say, I want to go here.
Yeah. But I think that's the balance, isn't it? In that leadership role, in those one-to-ones, is having those conversations so that people who do know what they want, who do know where they want to go, can talk that through. But also, I think, certainly from my experience, some people don't recognize their full potential, or they don't see what they are truly capable of. And I think that, in all of the leadership roles that I did, that seniority and being able to be the decision maker and being, all of that, yeah, that was great, that was cool. But actually being able to look at who you had in your team and look at that succession planning of thinking, okay, well, they're in this role now, but they would be great at this role over here. How do we support them? Do they know that that's what they want? Do we help them to understand that that's what they want, and how we can, what is it they actually want rather than what we think they want, and how do we then support them to do that? And I think that for me was one of the best bits about the leadership, is being able to develop the teams that you've got and just watch people flourish. I mean, somebody that came in at one of the entry level roles when I was with the major crime team has gone through fast track into the police, and I keep seeing them on television now doing press statements, and there's still that moment when you think, but you knew from that first couple of weeks that person was so much more capable of the job that they were in. It was just a matter of time and giving them that support and encouragement and training and development to see where it would take them.
If you look back over your whole time in the police now, what was the very best moment in all that time?
Gosh, that's such a big question. I mean, the police, there's a lot going on there. There's a lot of people that are leaving, and it is a very, very different world. But I can hand on my heart say I loved my time there. That is not to say that it didn't come without its challenging moments, because it absolutely did. But on the whole, when I look at the big picture, I loved every team that I was with, every job that I had, I absolutely loved. I think for me, I think I look at when we set up the non-emergency control room, from scratch, and recruiting in and bringing those teams up and training those teams, and having a very high performing team that you built from scratch. Probably is that I can't pin it down to one. There was lots of good times in there. Lots of crazy times and lots of things I can't talk about. Yeah. but some really, really good stuff in that. I worked with some really good people and good people doing really, really good stuff. The police get a really bad rap, but there's the majority of the people in there are just trying to do the best they can in really, really difficult circumstances. And I think people forget that sometimes, that, it's, people think that they're one of thousands, but actually on duty out on the street doing the job they're doing, they're one of sometimes single figures, and I think that's the pressure that they're under. But I loved every minute.
When we spoke about this, you'd already highlighted some of the like massive changes that you'd had, and obviously your constabulary was just one of many across the
Yeah.
UK. But it's those little changes that have made the modern police force as we know it, isn't it? So
Yeah, and it feels like you're a little bit of that legacy of those changes, what is now very much part of normal policing, having those conversations with police officers who were really, nervous about it, concerned about it. Some were excited and really enthusiastic, and how you kind of got the early adopters in and how you then brought everybody else on board. And yeah, I think there's lots of things that I was involved with that feels like I'm part of that legacy. But then also, there were a lot of victims, witnesses, people that I had those conversations with, that, people that walked into the police station or called up, made that first disclosure that whether they remember me or not, I know that I was that first person that sat with them and listened and heard and acknowledged, and I think that's also really important too. So I think, yeah, there's just so much.
now though, you focus a lot of your time and attention on public sector staff to transition into business owners. So the public sector has its own challenges with recruitment and retention, as do lots of sectors, but we're talking about the services that deal with crisis, save people's lives, in some cases just simply keep the country running,
Yeah.
And so many more things. Anyone who goes into public service, in my experience, they go into it for something so much more than a job. But every last one of them goes on their own journey with it. So they stay in as long as they can. For some people, that's, a few months or a few years, and some people are there for their entire careers. What do you think public sector staff need while they're still in the public sector? And what do they need when they're thinking of coming out of it?
I think when they're still in, I think it's really difficult, isn't it? Because, and this is not police specific, with any organization, when budgets are cut, the first budgets tend to be from the additional support services, leadership training, development training, often the first to go. And then that doesn't have an immediate effect, but it does have a knock-on long-term impact. And I think that is, from what I see now from different groups that I'm in, I mean, I've been out 7 years and a lot's changed in 7 years. But I do think even from when I was there, and I think it's probably just got worse because it's magnified, but I think a stronger investment in the people related. I think people need to feel that they're valued, but I think also, like you said, people join the public sector because they're passionate about helping people. They want to make the difference, whether it's the police, whether it's education, whether it's the council, whether it's the NHS. People, it's more than, like everybody says, it's a standing joke. Well, nobody does this for the money. Like, nobody goes into it because they want to make lots of money. They're people focused, people centric, and they're passionate about making a difference and doing that kind of work. What happens is, for a lot of people that then end up coming out, is it just becomes too hard to do. So then there's a values conflict, and we know that that leads often to burnout because they can't work in the way that they want to or need to. And it's like they're very passionate about being able to work in a certain way, and then the system is not allowing them to do that. So if you think most people who join police, NHS, education, council, well, certainly those first three, teachers want to teach, they want to be in the classroom, they want to be able to give children that attention, they want to be able to spend time with their children. Our system doesn't allow for that. the classes are too big, the level of support is too low, the resources are not enough. And it's the same for the police, and it's exactly the same for the NHS. It's all about triage and moving people through the system as quickly as possible. And then you've got the challenges around funding, resources, and then, and it just spirals. So I think that it needs resources and it needs investment, but it needs investment and resources into the people as much as it needs it into the system. So I think that would be my answer for the in. For coming out, I think this is the real problem. Like, I'm not here to coax people out of the organization. I'm not here saying life's so much better on the outside, because if I'm being honest, the work that I do now is relentless. I work a lot. I mean, I worked hard in the police, but I work a lot harder now running my own business. It's not easy. But there are people who, like me, I joined up for life. I had no intention of leaving. I came out through redundancy. The decision was not mine. And there are lots of people like that. There's also lots of people who recognize that mentally they are at burnout and they don't have anything left to give. And for their own health and well-being, they need to do something different. But also there are some people who are coming up for retirement. So, police, you do your 30 years service and you can go back in, but actually a lot of people want to do something different. But most police officers, if they've joined early, or certainly historically, it's not so much the thing now, but you would be retiring at 50. Well, at 50, quite often you've still got children that are going through university and you still need an income, even though you've got a good pension. So I think some people are choosing to come out because of the way the public sector is at the moment. But I think also there's a circumstance that people are having to leave and I think that's the fight for a lot of people, is that internal battle of the guilt of who they're leaving behind. But there's also actually, I don't want to leave. I'm still feel part of this. I still feel like I've got lots to give. And also as part of the identity for a lot of people, it was who I was. And I know that's not healthy, but it is what it is, and for a lot of people, if you've worked for 20 years in an organization and you always felt that that was your thing, your calling, or that was what you were there to do, and then you're told that you can't do that anymore, that's a lot to work through. So I think, what do people need? They need that support. And that for me was one of the biggest things, was actually, let's create a space where people can meet other people who are in similar positions. It's a safe space because it's, I work with a closed Facebook group, so they can have those conversations. But also for people that are creating a side hustle while they're still employed because they've got retirement in mind, or actually they do just want out, if they're not in that place where they're ready to talk about it publicly, or it's not in a place where they've declared it yet, or they're worried about what other people are going to think, they can work on their business in that safe space, and people understand why. They get that. And I think there's lots of shared skills, lots of shared experiences, but it's varied enough because it's across all of the public sectors. The conversations are varied enough that it's just challenges that thinking, because you come out so institutionalized because you've been told to think a certain way, you've been told to respond to things a certain way. It's all about processes and legislation and procedures and do it this way. So it's varied enough to challenge that, but it's still familiar enough to feel safe. And I think that's why it's working really well. It's taken me by surprise, to be fair. I wasn't expecting it to grow in that way and to be what it is for so many people. But yeah, I think that's what people need.
I agree. I think you need that space when you've been in what is a very unique part of the economy. You have to find people that ultimately understand.
Public sector does not run like a business, and that's part of the challenge that I'm supporting people with, is they don't have the understanding of why you need to be so visible, because we've spent years being invisible and not talking about what we do and checking and reading the room before we talk about what we do. There's lots of things about coming out of the public sector into self-employment that you've got a lot to learn that perhaps other people don't.
One of the things you spoke about when we talked about doing this episode, you said to me, I want public sector workers to understand that you don't have to do exactly what you've been doing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there is. I see, this is what I see play out in different Facebook groups of people that are wanting to exit. So not necessarily people that have a business, but certainly people that are wanting to exit. There's very much a pattern of, okay, this is what I've done in the police. Where can I do this in the public sector, in the private sector, sorry. And so what they're looking at is, and I get it, it's because it's familiar, it's because it's what they know, and it's because they're looking at a direct transfer of their skill set. I get it. However, I think what people are really missing out on is how many skills they have within those skills. And also, the private sector doesn't necessarily recognize what is involved in all of those things. So if you talk about like somebody who's trained in surveillance, like how does that translate into the private sector? There's a lot of skills that are required to do that. You talking about your family, the family member, your relation that's worked in the control room. So sure, that might translate if they wanted to go and work in a call center. But actually, we could probably spend another hour listing off all of the skills and all of the experience that they have that would transfer into so many different roles. And I think that's the thing, when you're looking at setting up a business, you need to look at what skills and experience you have, but you also need to look at what you're passionate about and what you want to spend your days doing. And actually, within the jobs that you've had within the public sector, like how much of that did you actually enjoy doing? And if you have the opportunity to shape that, what do you want to leave behind and what do you want to bring with you and do more of? And some people have done things that are completely different, and some people have done things that are the same or similar. But you do get to choose that. Like, you don't have to look at what you've done and then reshape that, remold it into something similar. And I think just having more of an open mind as to what could be possible can make a real difference. But I do think one of the things that people really struggle with is actually seeing what their skill set is. Terrible, because we don't get certificates for everything, so we can't like say, look, this is what I can do, this is what I've achieved, because we don't have a certificate, we don't have anything on paper that says this is everything that we're really good at. So we have to sit down and work that out for ourselves, and it's not something that I think people in general are particularly good at, because we've never had to do it.
And I definitely see that in the NHS, definitely. And I wonder if it's just because obviously a lot of people in the NHS have had to study very specific qualifications to be able to do the job that they do.
Yeah.
So, for example, radiographer, physiotherapist, obstetrician, all these people, they've got very specific qualifications that they've taken in order to be able to do their job. So they kind of live and die by that job title.
Yeah, those are technical skills though. There's also the technical skill, and then which is like the tip of the iceberg. And then there's all of these behavioral skills that sit under the surface that enable them to do that job. So that patient care, communication, data management, and we could be here all day again. Like, yes, this is the technical skill, but what were all those behavior skills that make you really good at what you do?
Absolutely. And a huge one that I see in a lot of NHS staff in particular, and that's purely because I'm surrounded by so many, is leadership. Because at any moment they may have to be the person in the room that makes the decision.
Yeah.
At any moment they may have to be the person that takes charge of a situation and starts telling consultants what to do. But they have to show that leadership with the patients, with their colleagues, with people from other departments. They show leadership consistently throughout their jobs, and they don't even realise that that's what they're doing.
And if we talk about what leadership is, it's influencing and guiding. It's not directing and telling. So you don't need to be in a leadership position to be leading. And in terms of, patient care, you're leading and you're guiding. You're influencing and you're guiding. You're helping people to understand the information, to translate that information to your communication skills, the decision making, the there's so much there that, until you almost need like a big A3 sheet of lots of different behavior skills and get them to sit down and highlight, oh yeah, when I did that, then yeah, I had to do that. And for people to actually see it in black and white and understand. It's why it's so hard to write a CV for a lot of them, because like, how do you translate to the outside world? And we love our acronyms and we love our little secret language because it makes us feel very important and very unique and, well, nobody knows what we're talking about. But then you try and translate that, like, what does that actually mean?
So I want to talk a little bit about women in leadership. I think I remember you saying to me that it was quite a male-dominated environment in the police.
Mm-hmm.
What was it like being a woman in leadership in the police?
I think I need to add the caveat that I was also a very young woman in leadership. So sometimes when I reflect on some of those experiences, it's hard to separate. Was it because I was young? Was it because I was female? Or was it not any of those things at all? People just not like being told what to do, which happens. And also I was police staff, not police officer. And certainly in the later years, I had responsibility for police officers, which was something that was very new. So culturally, big shift, because police officers are used to, a lawful order. So when their boss, who's a police officer, says you need to do this and you need to do this in this way, it's a lawful order and that it is what it is. You just go and get it done. The culture's shifting a lot in that probably doesn't happen as much as it would have done historically. But when that comes from police staff, that kind of, I think it bites a little bit for some people. So I think when I reflect back on the experiences, sometimes it's hard to decide whether it was age, gender, or that I was police staff rather than police officer. But yeah, very male dominated environment, but also not just male dominated in terms of gender, of positions, of people in those positions, in terms of energy, the masculine energy. Because of the nature of the organization, you use those masculine energies a lot more than you do the feminine energy. So you're much more direct, giving directions, much more transactional, much less collaboration, and let's talk about this and let's make sure everybody contributes, because you just don't have the time. You're like, what's the information? You're assessing the information, you're assessing the risk, you're assessing it against policies, processes, and law. You're making fast decisions. So it's very masculine energy in how you approach things. So I think when I first started, there were very few women in any of the senior roles. But also what I did notice was that as women were being promoted into those roles, they did tend to have quite masculine energy in terms of how they led. And that to me makes sense because the environment needed that energy. But I think for a lot of people coming up through the organization, certainly when I was mentoring leaders coming up through, they found that quite hard to balance the energy. And actually, I think now, and certainly in the later years, people were recognizing more that feminine energy, or the left and right brain energy, if you want to use those terms or prefer to use those terms, people were understanding that actually that had its place. And the leaders that were able to use both the masculine and the feminine, or the left brain and the right brain energies, to bring people together and get people on board and lead rather than manage, that was definitely starting to shift. And I think I came into the more senior leadership at the right time, or was maybe as part of that change in influencing. Actually, you can sit around the table and have that conversation and work in collaboration and invite everybody into that discussion and have a more nurturing approach to things. And yes, there will also be times where you need to shift across and shift that energy with it. So yeah, it's an interesting space, because I think you have women in leadership who are using a very masculine energy to lead. But I think that is changing, and there's much more mix. So I think that certainly for Avon and Somerset now, the chief constable is female. For a while, the deputy was also female, and the HR lead, I think, was also female. So in terms of, it was almost a 50-50 split in terms of gender. So I think it's nice to see more people coming up through, but there was a gap for a while in that middle management. And I think that's when you start to get into the family commitments, and is there flexible working? Are we blocking women coming up through leadership because we're not flexible in the approach? Like, what else can we do to remove the blockers for women that have got the skills, got the experience, and are ready to be in those positions? Like, what as an organization do we need to make sure we're doing to make sure we're not blocking their progress? So yeah, it was I think an interesting time. It's an interesting thing to reflect back on, that's for sure. But I think the conversations I'm having with companies now is that need for leadership, the what people need from leadership is changing. And that's not public sector specific, in terms of the generational, industry, cultural differences. People want something very different from leaders. And I think now, when I look back to when I first started, the way people were leading, that wouldn't work now. So I think whilst there was a shift in the time that I was there, I think it was probably representative of what else was happening in other industries as well.
No, I agree. I think hospitality, again, is another industry that shares that characteristic. It was a very autocratic environment, but I call them my first two real leaders came in, and one of them was the strongest autocratic leader I've ever seen in my life. She's extremely naturally autocratic, but she did it in a way that was motivating, empowering, did it in a way that was never personal. As you say, people are wanting something different out of their leaders. They want leaders, not managers.
Yeah.
And that's the big difference, I think, to any sector about whether they will survive or how they will survive going forward, is recognizing that employee-employer balance eventually needs to be equal. And even in an industry that requires almost pure direction all the time, you still need to do it in a way that empowers everybody behind you to just go, okay, yeah, we'll come with you.
Yeah. And I think the best leaders that I worked with in those years were the people that were able to balance those out, of recognizing when to step into those different like leadership styles. And I think also, I mean, when I first went into leadership, the boss that I had then, she was fantastic. She was firm, she was fair, you knew exactly where you were with her. She was very clear in her instructions and setting her expectations. I knew exactly what she needed from me, the way that she needed it. I knew the level that I needed to perform at, but I was also incredibly supported. And like you said, the support, the empowerment of knowing she was there if I needed that support, but also the autonomy to get on and do it in the way that I felt was best to do it. It was just such a great balance that ultimately she ended up becoming my mentor. I really admired her ability to be able to do that, of like how she could just give these instructions, like set high expectations, but at the same time feeling like you weren't being pushed, you were kind of being pulled in, and I think it amazed me that because I'd had an awful supervisor before that. So it was just, I was like, okay, this is so good, this is what I want to learn, and I want to be able to learn those skills and be able to do that for others too. And I think the people who are really good leaders are able to use all of those different skills and know when to use them to get the best out of people.
I spoke with an advocate for women in leadership a few months ago online, and we had a great conversation, because I love a good debate, about something that had come up in my feed recently, which was the subject of whether leadership programs for women were needed. I'm curious to know your perspective.
I think it has its place. I'm not, if I'm being totally honest, I am not a big fan of segregated anything, because I think that you lose sight of other perspectives that can be contributed when you're in a room full of a diverse room. I I think my preference, certainly for me, is to be in a diverse room. However, I think there are, when it's underrepresented groups, there is a need for those spaces that are more segregated to make sure that everybody in that room has that place to speak, be heard, and be able to adapt for that environment, to make sure they get what they need. And people do need different things. I don't know that that's necessarily gender specific, though. I think sometimes that's down to culture, it's down to age, and the more you segregate, the harder it gets. So I think my preference is always a mixed and diverse group, because the more you bring to the mix and you bring into the conversations, the more you open up the thinking, the conversations, and those discussions. And I think there's real power in that. But I do understand that certain groups of people value having that safe space of being in a room with people like them to be able to work on certain things. So yeah, I do think it has its place, but I would argue the value of having a mixed and diverse group. As a woman, I'm not a big fan of women only spaces.
Yeah. I think,
For me personally, however, I do recognize that other people really value that. And if you were to take that off the table, it would make a real difference to some people.
I think, yeah, it's a tricky one, really, isn't it? I mean, obviously this is just part of my perspective, but I distinctly remember the kind of leading point of view from me was everybody needs to be able to hear the whole conversation. If the vision is to get to a world where male or female doesn't matter, then how is separating anybody going to help?
And also, if we want women to excel in leadership, we need men and other on board.
We all need to be on the same platform.
Yes, and I think what we don't want to do is exclude people who don't identify with one or the other, and I see that happen a lot now. And I think there's so much that we can learn from a leadership perspective by being in a room with people who don't think like us. And I think that would be my concern if you were to only have gender specific training. Firstly, you exclude the people who don't identify with one or the other. So that's the first problem. And secondly, then you have the risk of ending up with an echo chamber, because you're only hearing people who potentially think like you. I think isolated ways of thinking is becoming more rare because we're so integrated as a society now. But there are also some people who live in areas where they don't have that integration, so don't have that exposure to different ways of thinking, different approaches. So, if we want women in leadership to excel, we need their male counterparts to understand what their challenges are, to be able to support that, and also change what has been the norm and the accepted. And they're not going to know that if they're all training in a little room over here.
Yeah.
So I do think we need to mix the groups. But I do understand, and I do understand, like, historically, like I remember, like, the first leadership courses I went on were predominantly men. I still learned, but did I hold back on maybe not sharing certain things? Quite possibly. We want to be our own critical thinkers and we want to develop. We need to increase our own awareness and we need to increase our own understanding. And I think it's only exposure to other people who are not like us that helps with that. But we can also only challenge, if we hear this all the time, don't we, where people say, there clearly wasn't a woman in the room when this decision was made, or there clearly wasn't a person of color in the room when this decision was made. And so the absence sometimes can really shrink the conversations and those discussions. And so for me, I think, I would always choose to be in a room that is a full mix of people. And I went to a really interesting talk. They were talking about, as a leader, your people in your boardroom should be challenging what you're saying. And so if they're all agreeing with you, you've recruited the wrong team, because you've recruited people who think like you. And if they don't think like you, but they're not challenging you, then your leadership style would suggest that they don't feel comfortable, confident, or safe enough to challenge. And that always stuck with me, because I think that's so important, that we need to, as leaders, we need to be comfortable with being challenged. And we also need to open up those conversations to hear the different perspectives in the room. And so that, for me, is why I think segregating out doesn't work for me. But I do understand that for some people they need those environments to be able to have those conversations with other people who get it, because that then supports their own development to be able to step into those other spaces. So I don't know that as a society we're quite ready to remove it, but I do think it's nice to give people that choice of having that space, if that's what is like business, isn't it? There's lots of women only business networking. It's not my preference, because my ideal client is not gender specific, so I'm losing out on people in the room by being in those spaces. But also, I work with people who wouldn't be able to be in that networking group because they don't identify as female, but then they can't go to the men's networking either. I think I see people being excluded when that happens, and I don't think that's always beneficial either. But yeah, interesting question. I'm going to be thinking about that one, I think, later on.
What do we all need to do now, in your opinion, then, to get to the point that there's no such thing as a female leader or a male leader, just a leader?
Oh, good question. I think we need to recognize that leadership has different strengths that are not attributed to gender. They're not gender specific strengths. So we can come away from that straight off the bat. Like, that's, I've worked with lots of people over the years that work in those different energies, and some are better than others. So I think we just need to come away from, and I think we are coming away from, that men are better leaders and women are better at, I think we're coming away from that. And I think the more we see leadership evolve into being able to use these different energies and lead in a different way, I think the less we're attributing those characteristics to the gender and more to the individual. So I think it's shifting. Certainly in the leadership work that I do in companies, I think people are seeing the strengths regardless, and I'm seeing more people being really open to working in different ways and tap into those different kind of elements to be able to get the most out of their team. So I think coming away from that and focusing on what do you need to have a high performing team, and adapting your leadership style for each individual within your team. And I think then it starts to shift those conversations away from attributing certain strengths and characteristics and skill sets to gender.
Yeah, I love that. I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I think that's definitely the primary thing. I suppose it all centers around just constant myth busting, doesn't it?
Yeah, but I think also challenging what is, what's a masculine energy and what's a feminine energy and what's a leadership energy. I'm like, I know I was called Cruella de Vil in one of the departments because I said no to people. And it's like, I'm not saying no for the sake of saying no. I'm saying no because no is the right answer to give. So I think there are people who, I think people interpret certain behaviors in a different way when it comes from a different gender. But like I said to you, I don't know whether that was because I was female, because I was young, or because I was police staff. It could have been any one of those three. And it was more about the individual than it was about me. They just didn't like being told no. So I think, we have this conversation around, female leaders who are assertive can often be seen as aggressive, and I think people are moving past that a little bit too. But again, the more people we've got in leadership that are able to display all the range, I think we move away from it. But people are people, aren't they? But I would like to think that the majority are, hopefully. But that's the role of a leadership influence, isn't it? I've worked in teams that have had individuals within the teams with zero leadership responsibility who have been real leaders. And they've been, at PCDC level, that have challenged and, really kind of influenced and shaped the culture of their team and the culture of the department by the way they show up. And they weren't paid to be a leader in any sense, but were one of the strongest leaders in that department.
What's your mission now?
Well, I guess from a personal perspective, I love what I do. I would like to be doing this for as long as I can, but maybe a little bit less as time goes on. And I went back to work full time when my son was 6 months, because maternity leave in as it is now didn't exist then, and I was the sole owner. So I would like to be in a position when my son potentially has children to be part-time, or if he chooses not or doesn't have children, I shall be traveling. So that's the plan, is eventually to be part-time and traveling and enjoying life. From a business perspective, it's just impact, what my values: making a difference, positivity, continuous improvement. So I think for as long as I feel like I'm, having impact, positive impact, then I will continue. But it's been the same mission right the way through, from that first job at 18 to what I do now. Is helping people find their voice, be heard, and get to where they want to get to. I don't think that's really changed. It's just in a different format. So
it's been an incredible conversation. You've highlighted some very important issues on both the public sector and women in leadership. You support your clients to become thriving business owners in their own area of expertise and help them see that there is something else they can do with the wealth of skills and knowledge that they have within them. If people want to connect with you, where can they find you?
I'm everywhere where you would expect me to be, but probably the easiest way is to head to the website, which is my name, so zoethompson.uk, and you can find me from there. But I'm on all the socials, and I'd like to think I'm visible, that you can find me. But yeah, I'm happy for anyone to reach out and ask questions or have conversation. It's been great. But you've asked some really intriguing, thought-provoking questions today. It's been really good. It's nice to bounce that around.
I'm glad you've enjoyed it. Zoe, thank you so much for coming on today. It's always incredible to talk to any female leader or any public sector worker, but you've shined a light on what that world is like. So I hope your work and the work of others like you creates more change yet to come, that's only going to improve the public sector, improve women in leadership, and make sure that this world becomes a better place.
That's been great. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome. It's been an insightful and empowering conversation. Thank you so much for coming today. Until next time, everyone.